Good morning. So, if you want to make money, you go to the United States. If you want to live a good life, welcome to Europe. Europe is the world's lifestyle superpower. But Christine Lagarde, the head of ECB, the European Central Bank, said recently, Europe is rebuilding its hard power. It's undergoing a major shift to build up its military power. This is, of course, in response to the big changes happening in the United States. History is happening now. But we don't realize it because we are too busy living our lives, whether it is, doing our work, going to the gym, taking children to school, getting health checkups, all the, recovering from holidays, etc., etc. But today, over the next 1 hour, we take a pause from our busy schedule to listen to experts trying to make sense out of the history that is unfolding in front of us. Where do we go from here? How do we get there? Welcome. Welcome to the 12th edition of Global Outlook, brought to you by our sponsors, Eide Cluster, GCU Node, GARD, University of Agder, the Arendal Fossa Company, and Agder Fylkeskommune. My name is Anita, and I'm today's moderator. First, some safety information. In case of an emergency, please exit through the 2 doors at the back and the 2 doors in the front. I feel like a stewardess now. And for any other emergencies, the toilets are marked clearly and they are downstairs. And for sending in questions to our speakers and panelists, it's the same procedure as last year. Please use, please download the Menti app, and that is the conference code. And you can start sending in your questions right away. So this year, Global Outlook is focusing on Europe, new realities for Europe. Is Europe entering a new era? Please welcome our keynote speaker, Foreign Minister Espen Barth Eide. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you, Arendalsuka. It's great to be here again at Global Outlook, and very much looking forward to this critically important conversation on new realities for Europe. And as Anita very correctly said, the starting point here is that the world is changing. The international system of trade and rules and regulations that we've grown up with, I would say everybody in this room, from the youngest to the most senior, will have lived their life in a post-1945 order, which we alternatively have been talking about as a rules-based order or a liberal world order. That is not exactly the same, but they are overlapping. And that is a system in which also modern Europe has grown, developed, and thrived. And I would say hardly any continent has benefited more from being part of the liberal world order than Europe, and particularly so in the last 3 decades, because after the end of the Cold War, after the demise of the Soviet Union and the voluntary breakup of the Warsaw Pact, we entered into an era of genuine globalization. Globalization was not a new word, but then it could become really global. And I think one of the high points in the era of globalization was when China joined the World Trade Organization, that really committed to the rules that were originally set up as a part of that global post-war order, and now really becoming near universal. Maybe not absolutely universal, but near universal. In that world, Europe developed, modernized, thrived, increased its internal cohesion. So a new world order replacing what we've used to is really serious news for Europe. Also for the rest of the world, but I think we can quite safely argue that Europe will be more affected than many other continents because we were so deeply involved in reaping all the benefits of the world order as we knew it. And I'm not saying that it is over. I'm not saying that all the elements of it is gone, nor that it's doomed to fail. But we have to say that 80 years after the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the era of the United Nations and of a rules-based world, this system is seriously challenged. So this is sort of the external ramification for this. Let me take one practical example connecting this to Norway very directly. As you all know, we are a member of the European Economic Area. That is an agreement which is now 31 years old. It was negotiated just before the end of the Cold War and finalized after the end of the Cold War. And it connects what we call the EFTA EEA states, so the states that are in the internal market but not in the EU, which is Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, to the EU internal market of 27, making 30 full members of the European internal market. When we negotiated the EEA, the European Economic Area, EØS på norsk, when we negotiated the EEA, it was in a world that was opening to more trade. It was in a world where customs barriers were being reduced, where all the adversaries became partners, eventually friends, and where economy and trade in many ways broke free from the security policy limitations that they had experienced during the Cold War years. So the whole sort of post-world order went into overdrive because it became really much more global. And what was important in Europe, and for those who remember back to the 80s, I'm sure there are some, I do, there was a commission president in the EU called Jacques Delors, and what he saw was that Europe was now done with reducing formal tariff barriers to trade. What was now necessary was to ensure that we had common rules, common standards, that we took away all the other practical limitations on intra-European trade, because that was really the issue. And they did so in what was in EU lingo called the 1992 project, which we then joined through the EEA in 1994. So at that time, this was really what mattered to Norwegian business, to Norwegian workforce, to Norwegian prosperity. And we, as other European countries, have clearly, and it's well documented, that we became wealthier, richer, had more wealth to distribute, to run our welfare system, and so on, because we were fully integrated into this Europe. So when I say Europe, it includes us, regardless of whether we are an EU member or a near EU member, as we are through the European Economic Agreement. So all of this affects us. But again, at that time, the issue was to complete the internal market, not by reducing the barriers that were already gone, but by reducing the remaining barriers on common standards, rules and procedures, and so on. What we're seeing now is a world that, again, is looking almost back to experiences of the 1930s, where tariff barriers, where more mercantilistic approaches to the economy, fixation on trade balances, a good trade balance, good, the bad trade balance, bad, which is really very different from sort of the whole ethos of the post-world order, where we would all benefit from regulated free trade, not totally unregulated, but an orderly, systemic free trade as we developed in the World Trade Organization and as we developed through free trade agreements. This world is now going into a very different direction, and that affects everybody, and it affects Europe probably more than anybody else, and that's why it's an issue here and an issue for us. This comes on top of new geopolitical trends. The two are related, but they're not the same. We have, again, war in Europe because of Russia's illegal aggression against Ukraine. A great power war in Europe has not been seen since the Second World War, so that's a massive change. We have a new dynamic around the growth of China, where people who used to cherish the fact that China became the world's factory are now asking new questions about Chinese dominance. And of course, we have the Trump administration in the United States of America, which seems to be in the midst of a process of voluntarily abandoning the hegemonic role of the ordering power of the system. Normally, there are two ways that empires collapse. One is because they are challenged by another empire, or because they either just don't get it right, or they simply decide to change their role in the world and look more inward, more to themselves. That seems to be happening with the United States of America, and that is a major change for us. This puts some very significant challenges on Europe, including ourselves. How do we balance our continued desire for a strong security partnership with the US, while at the same time understanding that the US is not providing that There we go. How do we balance the security dimensions of our partnership with the other dimensions? The answer, in my view, is more Europe, a stronger Europe, more European cohesion, and that seems to be happening. I think we see that we are now having a kind of a wake-up call. Some Europeans, ourselves included, realized that we left too much to the US. We left too much of the defense commitment to the US. We maybe were too comfortable in believing that this system would continue eternally, and that we need to do two things at the same time, which I think is my key message to this ensuing debate. One is to strengthen European cooperation, cohesion, competitiveness itself, also the intra-European work. And two or three very interesting reports have been commissioned, and they came out actually by two former Italian prime ministers, Mr. Letta, Mr. Draghi, who are both in their different ways talking about what is left to be done, what is yet to be done in strengthening the internal cohesion, but also the competitiveness of Europe itself, as of strengthen Europe. Norway, my government, very much supports this, and through our commitment in the EEA and the other partnerships we have with the EU, we want to be part of that increased European competitiveness, but then we also have to stand together in Europe to defend the integrity of the internal market. The second challenge is, in a sense, more global, a European role at the global arena, because if the US does less, others have to do more if we still want to have some elements of a rule-based order, a liberal order, an order that actually believes that cooperation is better than conflict, that fostering trade is more than transactional day-to-day relations, but a long-term commitment to common prosperity, which can develop long value chains. We are now here at Agder, and here many of the local industries are deeply involved in European value chains, meaning we produce products that are important for other companies' final products, and this is very much what we're connected to in the EEA, but also that this needs to have a global dimension. And but also the broader system, the protection of human rights as a common principle, the protection of rule of law, the protection of international humanitarian law. All of this now will rest more on Europe, and it's more important for Europe as Europe, but also European countries like Norway and others, to identify friends, allies, like-minded people, countries elsewhere in the world. Obviously, always trying to ensure that the Atlantic is as narrow as possible, meaning that we want to work with the US administration, regardless of who's the president, as much as we can, but also recognizing that it will probably not look like it used to do. And I believe that it's fair to argue that the changes that we are seeing, they might be in overdrive, they may be in an extreme version right now, but they are here to last. It's not like, around a few years down the road, everything will be normal. The world is changing in fundamental ways, and that means that we also have to think how we, as a European country, as a part of Europe, also takes a role in that, both in strengthening Europe, but also in looking for a role at the global scene for how we can try to preserve, modernize, and improve what needs to be improved, whether it is regional or global. And that's a challenge for Global Outlook, and that's a challenge for this part of Arendalsuka, and I thank you for the attention.
Wait, I have a few questions. Yeah. Thank you so much. Can we go a little forward in case? So we have a question from the audience. As big and new tech is becoming more and more influential in shaping opinions, how do we respond to their growing influence?
So this works now, I think, yeah. Massively important question. I think we are just beginning to understand the importance of this question. And again, I think, there are basically three alternative sets of regulatory regimes now. It's the American one, it's the Chinese one, and it's the European one. I think I know which I prefer, with GDPR and a higher standard of personal identity protection, for instance. But we really need to have the combined effort of saying new tech is here to stay and should be a force for good. It will not go away. We will have it. We want it. But also make sure that it becomes a force for good and not for bad. And that requires, I think, again, a strong European commitment. And I know that many European countries, many European actors are waking up to the reality that most of the platforms are American. And we could trust them because they were part of our shared liberal order. What will happen in the future if that order is not what we used to be? How do we deal with that here in Europe?
So how would you describe the world order that we are seeing now under President Trump?
Well, in trouble. It's not gone. It's not like, we still have the institutions and the rules we have. Most of the world's trade, remember that, while what we call the trade to GDP ratio in this country is very high. Approaching 100, it's less than 100, but it's very high. In the US, it's 27. So they're much less dependent on the world economically than we are, because it's a big internal market, and most European countries are more like us than the US. Most of the world's trade still happens on WTO rules. Let's not forget that. And that can actually increase because there is more appetite now for trading, without being so dependent on the shifting sentiments of America. In the global order, we have been adamant to say in our strong position on Palestine, this is driven by our concern for what's going on in Palestine itself, of course, but it's also a commitment to saying that if we only criticize Russia correctly for their violence and their illegal activity in Ukraine, but not dealing with other excesses and other violations, we don't really have rules for all any longer. So that's also standing up for a rules-based order. And the difference between domestic law and international law is that domestic law is controlled by authority. So if I break the law, eventually the law will get me, regardless of what I think about the law. Whereas in international law, it is state practice that either strengthens or weakens it. And here we have to be on the right side of history, also in our own self-interest.
Now, flattery seems to have worked with President Trump. At least he has committed himself to Article 5 of NATO, which is an attack on one is an attack against all. And so if Russia were to attack NATO, European NATO, then United States will come to Europe's defense. But what if we flip this and say, if the United States attacks, say, China over Taiwan, then wouldn't the European NATO countries have to fight along with United States, as they did in Libya, as they did in Afghanistan?
But, NATO means the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So that deals with the North Atlantic. That means Europe, Canada, and the US. And it's explicitly said that it's not about other parts of the world as a treaty. So there's no treaty commitment to join members' fights elsewhere. There might be other political considerations, but it's not. It's simply not a treaty commitment to take part in warfare that is not related to the North Atlantic area. And that's very much the purpose of NATO, and I think it's good to underline that in these days. There are, of course, other alliances, other partnerships, but NATO as such is what it is. And this is a defensive alliance against an attack. And it has actually worked because for 76 years, neither the 12 original nor the 32 current members have been attacked by another state. So it's a good insurance policy, and we should keep it like that.
I could argue with that, but we are running out of time. But thank you so much, Espen. It has been very, very nice to have you. This is the third year that we've had this foreign minister with us. Thank you so much. We appreciate it very much. Thank you. Thank you. I was pausing for a moment to experience the miracle of silence in an auditorium with 700 people. Now imagine a room full of angry people arguing about globalization, industrialization, nationalism, populism, the rise of the far right, the ongoing masculinity crisis. Where do you think this room is located? It's located in Europe. But the interesting thing is that these people were arguing so angrily more than 100 years ago on the same topics. History repeats, not because history has nothing better to do, but because we forget the lessons of history. So what do the events that happened more than 100 years ago, what do those events tell us about what we are experiencing today? Here is respected, renowned philosopher, historian, and writer Philipp Blom. Hi, Philipp.
Thank you, Anita. Good morning to you, and good morning, Norway. My name is Philipp Blom. I'm excited to be here, although I have a very difficult brief. I'm supposed to deal with all the difficult stuff and to depress the hell out of you. And to sugar the pill, I'm supposed to do this in a historical way. Now, let me just remind you of what you all know already, and that is that we live in a time of what has become known as a polycrisis, crises encroaching upon us from all areas. There is the climate emergency, which we've almost forgotten about. There's the degeneration of our democracies. There is AI and digitization that will come into our societies. And there's also, as the foreign minister has just mentioned, a breakdown of the international order and a renewed threat of nuclear war. In addition to that, millions of people in our own societies, and I'm glad to say not the 200,000 people who come to this festival for democracy, have disengaged from democracy, feel that democracy is no longer their preferred way of being governed. And while all of that is happening, civilians are being slaughtered and starved to death in front of our eyes in Gaza, and innocent people are being bombed and killed in Ukraine by a revanchist Russia. Faced with this reality, after the huge promises of the seeming victory of liberalism in 1989, many people feel betrayed and feel that they've given up. The future that we face is no longer a promise, it has become a threat. This reminds me of something that I read from a Russian journalist, Mikhail Tsigar, who said that people in Moscow are now talking that the same thing has happened to Washington and to Europe that happened to the Soviet Union in 1989. He said people in Russia are talking about the end of the West. And he said, why do we talk about the end of the West? Well, for the same reason that the Soviet Union failed. People have become cynical and they no longer believe in the official ideology. Have we become cynical? Do we still believe in the official ideology of liberal democracy? How can we understand all of this? Well, go back, young man, go back. Here's an historian speaking, what can I say? Let's turn to the year 1900, when the great story of the West really took off. A time of great optimism and great dreams of incredible growth, and of course a time of great colonialism and imperialism. In 1900, dramatic things happened. Technology flooded into the world. The modern world began. There were experiments with democracy. There was mass immigration in many cities. Indeed, people fled from the countryside into the cities, and in the cities they had to reinvent themselves. And there they also encountered mass media, mass newspapers, mass transportation, great sporting events, completely new ways of living. You can imagine what that meant for people, but you can also imagine how deep that went. This is also a time of the first great crisis of masculinity in the West, as women were asking for more rights and indeed equal rights, and men were fearful of their manliness. But these societies were overwhelmed by a surge in democracy, not in democracy, but in technology, and we all know what happened. What happened was the second 30 Years' War that Europe suffered through, the one from 1914 to 1945, as empires and markets crashed into each other. Now let us fast forward to 2025, and the same issues with transformation in a political world, and the same issue with technology driving it all, and indeed such very similar events when you look at the deterioration of democracy, but also, for instance, at gender roles and gender fluidity and the fear of men of losing their manliness. Technology has created this latest surge in our world. It has created globalization, which depends on the use of oil and on container shipping. It has changed our democracies with information technologies, the internet and social media. And its migration is driven by cheaper air travel around the world, which was not possible before. That's why historians look at this period as the great acceleration. And we indeed are living in the time of the greatest change that humanity has ever encountered. So what will follow from that? Are we also headed for another world war? Where is this all going? We're living in a different world. Our world has become an imperial world in which we have to stand. And as a cartoon of 1900 reminds us, if in this kind of world you don't have a seat at the table, you are on the menu. So what does this mean? Endarkenment after enlightenment? What kind of time are we going towards? Well, again, there are echoes perhaps to the 1930s, when Antonio Gramsci was sitting in an Italian prison and was writing, "We are living in a time of monsters because one order is decaying and another order is not yet born, and in times like this, monsters are born." And we can already see the outline of a new order that is trying to impose itself, and it is not pretty. It is an order of surveillance capitalism, AI-supported oligarchies, an end to human rights, to freedom, and to democracy as we understand it. So, what is on the horizon, and why is this future become a threat? Does European democracy have the strength and the political will to defend its interests in an imperial world? Can Europe rise up, not to control and conquer others, but to be a strong partner and to ensure its vision of human rights, solidarity, and political participation? Or have we simply all become too fat and lazy to do anything about it? We tend to forget that we're all the children and grandchildren of generations who accomplished the impossible for their own time and their own society. Only look at Europe after the Second World War. And that means that we will simply have to accomplish the impossible again. How do we create a future that is a promise and not a threat? How do we create a democracy that can coexist with digitization and even flourish? Can we reinvigorate the creativity and solidarity of our societies? What can we hope for? Hope always means a shared project, a shared collectivity. It is not an isolated thing. And perhaps hope and agency in this world is not as far removed as we may think it is. And in one last look back at history, let us look back at that time when liberalism appeared to have won in the world and triumphed, when we believed that everything would be drawn into the liberal orbit and there was no avoiding it, that beautiful illusion that people lived with. 1989. It was also the time when the Iron Curtain came down and things changed in Eastern Europe. For instance, they changed for Václav Havel in the Czech Republic, who was a political prisoner and became its president. And so let me close with Václav Havel and his thoughts about hope, because they are what gives me hope today. Havel wrote from his prison, "The kind of hope I often think about, especially in situations that are particularly hopeless, such as prison, I understand above all as a state of mind, not a state of the world. Either we have hope within us or we don't. It's a dimension of the soul. It is not essentially dependent on some particular observation of the world or an estimation of a situation. Hope is not prognostication. It is an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. It transcends the world that is immediately experienced, and it is anchored somewhere beyond our horizon. Hope, in this deep and powerful sense, is not the same as joy that things are going well or willingness to invest enterprises that are obviously headed for an early success, but rather the ability to work for something because it is good, and not just because it stands a chance to succeed. I wish us all that kind of hope for our very difficult future. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I was under the time.
Yeah, very good. Absolutely. It's just amazing how from history he went to philosophy. Thank you so much. I want to talk about very current thing, far-right populism, which is rising in Europe. But the strange twist is that this time round, far-right populism in Europe is supported both by the United States and by Russia. How is this going to shape Europe in the future?
If you want a brutal answer, and as we have little time, I think this is the answer to give. I think there are two ways forward for Europe. Either we become a European federation that is equal in heft and political will and energy to other great powers, or one state in Europe after the other will be flipped by troll armies, by party financing, by disinformation, by political assassinations, all of which is already happening in Europe, and will become vassal states of China, Russia, the US. I think these are the two possibilities we have.
That's a frightening prospect. Revolution. We have to fight for this, against this.
There is a frightening prospect, but there is an alternative to this frightening prospect, and that is if we get out of our behinds and do something about this. Yeah. We all know what needs to be done, what is lacking. The only thing is not the technology, not the knowledge, not the institutions, it's the political will.
And what about, you're a historian, so when you look at the big leaders, the three big leaders of the world today, what do you think would be the global impact of President Putin, President Xi of China, and President Trump?
Well, they've set us back 100 years in policy terms. We are back in an imperial world where great powers have their spheres of influence. And yes, where if you don't have a seat on the table, you're on the menu. And at the moment, Europe has to decide which of the two we want to be.
If you go to, for example, in France, the Champagne district, and you travel around, you would never guess that these were the battlefields of World War I. And that, to me, is the miracle of Europe, that A savage past has been transformed into a peaceful, beautiful, luxurious present. But there are security experts who say that this has made Europe soft. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it hasn't made Europe soft. We have allowed it to do that. I read something recently by someone who said Germany's economic model is destroyed because for the last 30 years, Germany's success relied on cheap energy from Russia, an export market in China, and security from the US. That's a curious way of running a country. I think if we don't take capabilities back into Europe, think of it, Europe doesn't have its own AI agent. There are initiatives, but they are wildly underfunded. If this great economic transformation happens with digitalization, Europe will be entirely dependent on software and other goods that come from outside. It cannot regulate them fully. It can also not change these things. So this is really a big political question, how we deal with that.
People who remember history say they are concerned by the remilitarization of Germany. Do you share their concerns?
I share their concerns, absolutely. We come from militarist societies, and we know that militarism is a bad thing. And there will be huge challenges in balancing this out. We are proudly civil societies, we are proudly participatory societies. We don't like the military logic, the military hierarchy, the structures of command. This is not what we want in our civilian societies. But incidentally, as for Ukraine, it will be a huge challenge to make the transition from a country at war to a country at peace again. But these things are very hard to find a balance in.
But what is Europe to do if the Russian threat exists right on their border?
Well, that is the problem. We have to follow the way back into the past and rearm ourselves. Something that makes my heart bleed, and also every dollar that goes to tanks doesn't go to schools. So this is a bad situation, and the obvious way to overcome this situation is to have some kind of other kind of governance in Russia. But this is not something we can engineer and do, and as we see with our biggest and firmest friend, the United States, this can change so quickly that if you don't have two own feet to stand on, suddenly you have nothing to stand on.
We're run out of time, but one quick question for which 10 seconds. We know how the Trump first regime ended. How will the Trump 2 end?
Well, if it's not the next hamburger, I really don't know. The even greater danger than a third Trump term is a first Vance term. And at the moment, we don't see in the United States any real political sea change. There are two parties, both of which are dependent on money from big corporations, and that's all the democracy there is.
No, thank you. On that happy note.
On that happy note. Thank you very much.
I have a question for you. Say you wanted to start something new, a business or a project, and you think big, and you start it Europe-wide. It doesn't go so well. What would you do? Most people would say maybe scale down, go down to the municipality level, learn from the mistakes, and then scale up. But not our next speaker. She started something Europe-wide. She was not very happy with the way it went. So instead of going to the municipality level, she went worldwide. So here is our next speaker, Colombe, Cahen-Salvador. I have a problem saying the three words. Colombe, Cahen-Salvador. And she's going to talk to us about hope for Europe lies in action. Sorry.
Thank you. No worries. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So I was just told backstage that Norwegian audiences don't really answer when you ask questions, so I'm going to need your help, and I'm going to need you to answer. Go back 2 seconds to middle school. You learned about the Second World War. When you learned about the Second World War, did you go out of the room thinking, would I have resisted? Would I have fled? And did you end up discussing it with either friends, family, or your teacher? Please raise your hand, prove Christoph backstage wrong, if you did actually do that, if you ended up discussing what you would have done. Okay, most of you did. I did too. I went home and I was sure that I would have resisted. I was sure. I told my dad I would have resisted, we would have done the right thing, etc. Obviously, if you look at history and how we act today, this is not how things go. This is not what we do. I'm not saying this to shame you or to shame myself, but to use it as a wake-up call. Right now, we see our countries often declining demographically, politically, and even morally. Europe and our countries support genocidal regimes, buy oil from dictators, and contribute to the climate collapse. We are supposed to do better than this. Our middle school selves would want better. I've tried. As you've heard, for the last 5 years, I've tried to build a global political movement because I believe that a lot of the challenges we face across the world are global. We need to work on them together. So we need to tackle climate, wars, unregulated artificial intelligence together. It's called Atlas. And in the past, I built a European political party called Volt that sits in the European Parliament and in multiple parliaments across Europe. And I did so because I have the belief, just like post-Second World War, that European collaboration and our countries are supposed to try to not repeat the mistakes of the past. We're supposed to ensure that division and hatred does not overtake our continent again. Again, it's not going so well. Our countries love to position themselves as champions of human rights. You've heard it, as countries that will uphold international law. Well, our countries are some of Israel's biggest supporters through its occupation, apartheid, and genocide. This country, where the conference is taking place, has until, I think, today, refused to divest its wealth fund from Israeli companies that are directly responsible, in part for the occupation, making it complicit in Israel's crime. We all want a green Europe. We want our children to be able to grow up in a healthy environment. And a lot of countries are doing great. They're doing big efforts to decarbonize, while often ramping up aggressively the oil and gas industry. And look, I'm talking about Norway, but you can hear my accent. I'm French. France is at least as bad. It's a problem we all have. So then we have the question, what can we do? What should we do so that our middle school selves would actually be proud of us? Let me start with my deep belief. For Europe to be resilient and relevant, it has to lead based on values, not just its strategic interest or economic interest. And this means, because our governments are not doing it, it's up to us. So how? You have 3 ways, I think. The first one is you go the institutional way. You make your way to your government or to a big institution like the United Nations, and you make change from the inside. You have the second one, I don't recommend it, but I still need to mention it. You yield enough power, enough money that you can bend the will of institutions to your own. It's a bit dystopian, we're living through it often. Wouldn't recommend this one. Or you have the last one. You act. You spark a flame. After years of work in activism and politics, I believe that when people rally, anything is possible. And we've seen it. Look at the suffragist movement, at the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. It's possible. So back to you. You have to act. The future of Europe is in your hands, not in anyone else's. You get to join protest. You get to boycott. You get to join resistance movements. When you go home, don't turn on Netflix, but try to imagine for a second, what would Europe look like if it led with values, if it led with our collective well-being in mind, our planet's future? And then stop imagining and make it happen. Thank you.
I'll ask you one question. Let me just see if there's any questions from the audience. No? Well, I just wanted to say something to what you said. As always, very interesting, very good, very passionate. And I think the Sovereign Wealth Fund heard that you were coming today and speaking, because they did divest yesterday, I think.
From some companies, not all.
Yes, not all, but at least the step has started, so we begin there. If there are no questions, then I will let her go. We would like to wish her, she's expecting a baby. She and her husband are expecting a baby, so I don't want to stress her too much by making her stand. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Two of our speakers today spoke about the wake-up call. I remember, when Trump came to power, all of Europe, all of Norway was talking about strategic autonomy a la France. But then we know what happened. Biden came and everything was forgotten. The wake-up call, the wake-up call. And you really have to wonder, why don't politicians get off their bed and think long-term? We have to do something about this in terms of strategic autonomy, if that's what you want. So now we go to the next part. This year, Global Outlook is only for 1 hour, unfortunately. So the auditorium, we have to leave the auditorium exactly at 1 o'clock. It's a truncated program. So now we will go into straight away into our panel discussion on disinformation. May I request our excellent panelists to please come on stage. So that's Nina Jankowicz, and she is with the American Sunlight Project, which has done some fantastic work on disinformation. And we have Oksana Brovko. She's the president of the regional Association of Regional Publishers in Ukraine, and also done some fantastic work in the war front, which is, as you know, the first casualty of war is truth. Nina has done a lot of work on a very scary topic, and she's done such extensive research that it is just like reading fiction. So she has talked about the coming flood of disinformation. So if we thought that we were already drowning in fake news, well, hold on to your life jackets, because this flood is going to come our way. Can you explain to us, Nina, why are you expecting this flood to happen?
Well, I wrote that article in Foreign Affairs at the beginning of 2024, and actually the flood is really, the floodgates are open now. Things are getting much worse, and that's in part because over the past several years, organizations like mine, researchers like me, have been under attack from people who profit and use disinformation for power. They have undermined our work, they have sued us, they have harassed us, and now that they are in office in the US government, they have undermined the US government institutions that were pushing back against disinformation, not only from the social media platforms, things happening domestically, but also the global threats that we face from Russia, China, Iran, and others. All those institutions are gone, and it's coming to Europe now.
What should we as ordinary people expect?
Well, I think we're going to see a lot more, easily spread disinformation. We're not seeing the friction that we saw from the social media platforms because, unfortunately, they're in cahoots with the U.S. government and they're not doing the sort of content moderation and checks that they used to do. And that means that democracy is under threat because these lies, make no mistake, are targeting our democracies.
She testified before the Congress. I don't think they're going to call her again. Oksana, tell us, if things are bad in the so-called peaceful world, how much worse it is in the war front. Tell us about the disinformation that happens.
For us, disinformation that is not truth. That is a part of a huge propaganda campaign, Russian propaganda, which starts a lot of years ago. And that influence on our everyday life, not at the front line, but in the whole country, and in Europe, actually, in the whole world as well. That influence on our behavior, on our psychological and physical situation, and what we are doing, what decision we are making. For example, at the very beginning of a full-scale invasion, we have a huge disinformation campaign about possible nuclear explosion using chemical weapons, and that influence should make a lot of mess, for sure, for local citizens, for local people. Same as the most powerful or symbolic disinformation campaign made by Russian. It was about Bucha after Russians went out from the city, and when we saw how many civilians were brutally killed, how many civilian bodies were under torture, and Russians just tell that was actors, that was a theater, yeah. So that influence incredibly, especially now.
If you have any questions, please do send. You know the Menti app, and the conference code is given over there. So in case you have, please do send. We have another 5 minutes, so we can receive your questions. So the Merriam-Webster says that disinformation is most probably a translation of a word in which language? Russian. Surprise. So Nina, tell us about the geopolitics of disinformation, and why is disinformation such a powerful tool?
Let me start with the second question. It's because often people are looking for an easy way to understand complex themes, events, etc. They're also looking for community, right? So both of these really came to head during the COVID pandemic, where people were online all the time, alone in their homes, and trying to understand fast-moving scientific events, and they were given easy explanations, right? Russia and other autocratic states recognize this. They recognize that they can play on these psychological weaknesses that we have, and they've been given tools via the social media platforms that allow you to target the most vulnerable people at exactly the right moments, right? So as Oksana has just pointed out, this isn't just about lies on the internet. This is life or death in places like Ukraine and Gaza. And that's why it's important that democracies grapple with disinformation as a national security threat, but also something that threatens our very way of life.
Oksana, you've said that in the landscape of disinformation, the print medium plays a very powerful role. Can you just explain to us why that is so?
No, especially close to the front line, where people have really limited access to the electricity, limited access to the internet. Printed media play the sole role to deliver the truth to the local readers. You know how works of our local media, local editor in the city like Arendal looks. It's to find how to print your newspaper, then organize the delivery of this newspaper under protection of militaries with support of special rescue teams. They deliver these 700 or 500 printed copies to people who still live under the shelling, you know, in the frontline cities. During last weeks, we launched a new system of delivery as well. We launched anti-drones corridor. It's a special covering of the roads to deliver the newspapers and food, clean water safely. And local people, local citizens, they can receive the truth, only thanks to the printed media. That's why it's crucial during the war. Even the media trends goes down in the whole world.
There's a question from the audience. How do you identify and fight disinformation? Both of you all can, you know. Nina, start.
Well, you know, I think it needs to be what I've often called a whole-of-society approach. We do need regulation, and I was glad to see that the Norwegian government has put out a policy of how to approach disinformation. It includes things like information literacy, but it also includes the Digital Services Act potentially being implemented here in Norway. And I think there's strength in numbers. I think that's a really smart approach. But we do also need to recognize our role in spreading disinformation, right? Every click is a vote. Every click is $1 for these social media platforms. So spend them wisely.
Oksana?
You know, we have so many fakes, so many disinformation inside Ukraine that it's really impossible to fight with each piece of disinformation. So I still believe, I think that it's very important to invest into the local media, into the local press, because they work on the ground. They are the first who will read the disinformation or fake and have a real possibility to fact-check that and explain people they were under influence. And critical mindset, critical thinking, that is something which we need to develop more and more in such conditions in which we are working. Work with young audience through media literacy programs and starting from schools or kindergarten, yeah? Working with elder people and explain them why emotional clickbait headlines should, you need to check them and to think one more time why you read this article, that you can be under influence.
Yes, you're right. At the end of the day, the decision is up to the individual, whether they want to reject or whether they want to accept the disinformation. But for that, they need to have, as you rightly said, critical thinking to decide what is disinformation and what is information. And in fact, that is our one question over here. Is critical thinking enough to identify and fight disinformation, or what better way to control it?
Well, in my research across Europe that I did leading up to 2020 when my first book came out, I was in 6 countries, and I saw that the countries that were most resilient against disinformation were the ones that invested, just as Oksana has said, in information literacy and building resilience and critical thinking in the population. It is not a panacea, don't get me wrong, and there is a way that it can go too far, but it's an important first step.
So the last question from the audience that we can take. What is the first thing on your wish list? Brief answer.
An end to the war in Ukraine.
Sorry? It's easy for me. Yeah, victory is the first thing in our wish list.
And you?
Well, I also wish for an end to the war in Ukraine, and I think that would deal one of the world's biggest disinformation purveyors a fatal blow. So that's what I'm hoping for as well, Oksana. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you. Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Oksana. Thank you so much. Please remain seated while I just wrap up the conference. So we've heard a lot about hope today, and hope is different. It's not the same thing as optimism. Optimism is passive. It is like you just wish for things to get better. Hope is about agency. Hope is about you taking action. Hope is about not giving up hope. I want to leave you with a final image of a 13-year-old Turkish boy, Osman. He was, 2 years ago, he created a world record. He survived for 11 days under the debris of a building flattened by an earthquake. He was trapped under the broken concrete, injured, frightened, hungry, thirsty. The oxygen level was coming lower and lower, and yet, whenever he could, he kept crying out for help. And 11 days, he kept up his hope. Equally important, the rescue volunteers also did not give up hope. They were looking for volunteers 8 days after the earthquake, 9 days after the earthquake, 10 days after the earthquake, and on the 11th day, they found Osman. So for hope to succeed, both the individual and the community, in this case, the rescue volunteers, must work together, must keep trying, must not give up hope. Because as long as we live together on this planet, ours is a shared destiny. Hope is not just a feeling, not just an emotion. Hope is a promise of a better tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today. You've been a wonderful audience, so attentive. Thank you so much, and thank you to our wonderful speakers and panelists, and thank you to all the Team Global Outlook, our sponsors. I want to say a special thank you to our Global Team Outlook team leader, Helena Flagmark. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your leadership. And a big word of thanks to Team Global Outlook. And I'd like to just mention them by name: Espen, Anne Elizabeth, Christoph, Lars, Sophia, and Christine. Thank you so much for your months and months and months of hard work to shape this program. And thank you so much to Eric and his team for all the help, for technical help. Thank you all for being with us today, and enjoy the rest of Silka. Thank you. We'll remain over here because they're going to come and take some pictures of us, a group picture. So just remain, they'll take the hall, this thing.